Some people want it to happen. Some wish it would happen. Others make it happen. I'm Dave DeFore, the Department Chair for Scouting, Video, and Analytics for Sports Business Classroom. In our scouting program, our students' instruction begins with an inside look at the job of an NBA scout. From there, we jump right into live Summer League game scouting from the stands of the Thomas & Mack Center, led by experienced NBA personnel. The live game scouting is then supported and supplemented by extensive work in the video room to round out the curriculum. In our analytics component, our instructors will lead students through the process of combining analytics with hands-on scouting to filter the signal from the noise. We teach both the art and the science of scouting. In short, our staff uses their combined decades of experience to provide a week-long program that is unmatched in intensity and scope. Before completing our scouting program, students will have learned how to compile a detailed scouting report with the help of longtime NBA scout Dan Purcell. Every scouting student will leave with the skills to show their work and insight into the inner workings of an NBA front office. Do the right thing for your career by visiting sportsbusinessclassroom.com today.
Welcome back, fans of the NBA, fans of basketball. I'm Aaron Washington, your host of the NTC podcast. You may notice that tonight, I am writing solo, but I want to keep this brief and just give you guys an update on a few news stories that have broken here over the past couple of days in the NBA. Things are getting quite wild as we monitor Twitter, monitor Instagram, social media of any kind. If you go anywhere on the web, you will see rumors flying. You will see deals being made, being completed. Doesn't matter where you go. Things are popping off fast and furious as we approach free agency, which as of this recording is just a day away, June 30th, 6 p.m. Eastern time. So with that in mind, there are a few stories in particular that I wanted to highlight and give a little bit more insight into as we have the initial reactions. We have the big names. We have Woj and Shams updating us on exactly what happened, the terms of each agreement. But what I wanted to do in this brief podcast, I won't talk you guys' head off solo here, but my mission is just to highlight these few news stories that are very prevalent and will have a huge impact on several teams around the league, and then dive in a little bit deeper as it pertains to teams' cap space situations, draft pick situations, and the like. So with that being said, just wanted to dive into these news stories here real quick for you guys and get you on your way and hopefully give you a little bit more information, arm you with some more information as you're discussing these deals on social media. You're discussing them with your friends, your family, the barbershop, what have you. It's always good to be a little bit more educated when it comes to the NBA and inner workings, exactly what's going on behind the scenes. Just as a quick note, be sure to keep an eye on our draft capital page over at NTC, our website, notradeclause.com. I will be updating those picks in real time as we progress through the summertime. Anil handles our cap sheets. Those are going to be updated as quickly as possible as well. We'll have graphics coming up for you guys. The transaction log. We'll have a list of every signing trade that goes down in the off season. So be sure to keep it locked on our website if you want all the most up-to-date information. So with that being said, the first news story that popped off here as of yesterday, we saw this coming. Everybody pretty much figured it was on the horizon. It was just a matter of when it was going to take place. As of yesterday, John Wall is no longer a member of the Houston Rockets. He reached an agreement with the Rockets. The two of them mutually agreed to a buyout, which means that the Rockets are essentially going to pay John Wall to move on to a new team. Now, those of us who are in this field right now, kind of digesting this content, it must be nice, right? If we're looking at this from our perspective, must be nice to get paid by a team that you're leaving almost the full amount of your salary for 1 year to go play for another team and have a chance at a championship, which is the Los Angeles Clippers. That's pretty impressive. I will get to the Clippers in a minute because there are several financial implications of this deal that will make their future a little bit more interesting to follow. But in the meantime, first off, looking at this for Houston is on the hook for not all of Wall's salary, but a very large part of that. They're on the hook for $40.9 million of his original $47 million that he was owed as a result of picking up that option for the 22-23 season. So essentially, Wall gave back about $6.5 million of that 47 million back to the Houston Rockets. They will have to absorb. That's going to be dead salary on their books for next season. But they do open up that spot in the rotation for another player to kind of come in, fill in those minutes, which, to be honest, there's not a lot of minutes went towards Wall last season. He got quite a lot of PTO, if we're being honest, last season. But the season before, he did play a decent amount of minutes for them. And if we're going back to Wall's last fully healthy season, he averaged 23 points per game, 4.2 rebounds, and 10.7 assists. He was an all-star in his last full season. So this is a player that did some good things in Houston. He averaged 20 points per game in the 2021 season for them. He started for them. He had some good moments, but his efficiency just wasn't quite there the way that we're used to seeing it from John Wall. Not that he was ever a super efficient player, but his three-point percentage was sub 30%. His two-point percentage was sub 40%. So definitely not marks that you want to see from your starting point guard. But for Houston, this is more about their youth movement. If you take a look at what they're working with in terms of their salaries, their next highest paid player on their team, now that Christian Wood is also out of the picture, is going to be Eric Gordon at $18.2 million. So the Rockets have a couple of options as far as how they can approach the offseason. If they want to, they can open up about $5 million in actual cap space if they renounce some of their cap holds, such as Dennis Schroeder, Bruno Fernando, Jason Tate, which is a restricted free agent. So we're assuming that he's going to get a new deal from the Rockets. So if we're being honest, if we're going to look at this from the most likely scenario to take place, Jason Tate is going to be re-signed for a number higher than that 1.8 million that he was going to get in that team option that the team declined, and they're going to operate as an over-the-cap team. Now, they will be quite a ways away from the luxury tax. I mean, they're already about 32 million under the tax, and they will stay easily above 20 million under the tax. So that's not a consideration for them. They're just going to need to resign a few players and presumably look for a trade partner to possibly absorb Eric Gordon's salary. But we have to keep in mind that it's always nice to have a couple of vets on your team, especially with a team as young as this one that the Rockets are trying to build organically. Having a guy like Eric Gordon in the mix, he's still a very useful player, a little bit overpaid at this point of his career, but vets help bridge the gap between one era of basketball to the next. They help out the young bloods to kind of get acclimated to the game, so on and so forth. So maybe they keep him around for another season and then deal with him next season. We're going to have to wait and see how that all goes. But for their situation, I guess it would make sense to kind of keep him around for one more year. Now, with their draft capital situation, they're actually looking pretty decent. So they drafted 3 players in the 2022 draft. They still have that going for them. And then they have a pick swap with the Nets for 23, also 25 and 27. And then they have some pretty nice first-round picks in 24, 26. They own their picks outright in 28 and 29. So the Rockets are set up very nicely for the future. Their talent pool is very solid when you look at Jalen Green. You're looking at Jabari Smith Jr., who was just drafted number 3 overall. They still have guys like Alperen Sengun waiting in the wings, Kevin Porter Jr., Josh Christopher, who came on last year. And then some of their new guys like Ty Washington are coming aboard. So the Rockets have something brewing down there. It's going to be another year, probably 2, before they're ready to truly compete in the Western Conference. But as of now, they're doing some really great things with that team. And it's going to be interesting to watch exactly who gets the minutes for next season, because there are a lot of young players that are going to be competing for those minutes, both in the starting unit and in the next 5. So we're going to have to see who separates themselves other than Jalen Green, Sengun. I mean, those guys are automatically going to be in the mix. But after that, it's going to be a little bit of a puzzle that the Rockets have to put together in that regard. But moving on to the Clippers side of things, this is where it gets really interesting. So John Wall's new destination is reported to be the Los Angeles Clippers. Now, that's not official because we're not quite in free agency period yet. We still have another 24 hours to go or so. But it's been reported, and it's very likely that he will look to join the Los Angeles Clippers, which makes a lot of sense. Because for a guy like John Wall that is post 30 years old now, he's in the second half of his career. He's diminished. He's not quite the same player he was in Washington and in some points in Houston. He's looking for a chance to compete at a very high level, and going to the Clippers affords them the opportunity to be in one of the best teams. Some people would say the best team that had the best odds at competing for a championship in the 22-23 season. So he comes on the Clippers roster for about 6.4 million, which is what the tax pyramid level is worth. And the way that these guys set up their deals is they basically give back the amount of money to their team they're leaving that they're believed to get from their new team. So that player ends up breaking even, they net even, they just give some money back and then they recoup that money with their new team. So these guys are smart. They give money back. They say, thanks. Here's a small, very small token of my appreciation for, giving me a chance to have some minutes with your team. I'm going to go get my money elsewhere. So these guys have it all figured out. They're not losing really any money in this arrangement. They're just getting it from another team. They have two teams paying them for one season. So if we're going to dive into the Clippers cap sheet a little bit here, their roster is one of the most expensive in the league. They're on par with teams like Golden State as well as the Brooklyn Nets. Very, very high payroll that is far above even the tax line at this point in time. So to kind of put things in perspective, their top two highest paid players on this team, as we know, the headliners, Paul George and Kawhi Leonard. If you add their two salaries up, you combine the two, you're looking at almost $80 million between two players. You're looking at about 79, 6 or 7. So basically $80 million for two players. You add in Marcus Morris, Norman Powell, Luke Kennard, Robert Covington, all these really solid complementary players that are going to be playing alongside their top two wings in PG and Kawhi. You end up with a total team salary for next season to be somewhere in the realm of $191 million. Now, another piece of news that came out today as of June 29th, the league set their salary cap and luxury tax amounts, which admittedly are higher than initially expected, which is going to be about 123 million for the cap for next season, and then 150 million for the luxury tax. So if you guys are doing the math at home, that means that for next season, if the Clippers have a payroll of somewhere in the neighborhood of 191, probably going to be a little bit higher since Nicholas Batum still has to be re-signed to a new deal. I mean, 190, $200 million, they're $50 million over the new luxury tax line, which, reported to be 150 million. The tax apron is 156 million. So for this team, they have a massive tax payment incoming, which could be as much as 40, $50 million alone just in their tax payment. So their actual amount that they're paying for this team, once you add everything up, is going to be well over $200 million, which is an absolutely insane amount of money for any team. But the great thing about the Clippers, and here is where ownership really plays a part. They have an owner by the name of Steve Ballmer. As we know, Steve Ballmer spares no expense. Ballmer is one of the most passionate NBA fans, NBA owners you will see in the game, and he is not afraid to spend in order to give this team a chance to win. So their luxury tax history going back about 2 seasons, in 2021, $6.6 million for this team in their tax, total tax payment. 21-22, $83 million. So their tax bill for 22-23 before John Wall was about 21 million. That spikes to about 40 million after his signing, because you have to remember that luxury tax payments are separated into brackets. So as you progress through the brackets, the penalties for every dollar over the tax increase exponentially. So this is going to be the third year in a row over the tax. The Clippers are looking at a possibility of a repeater tax penalty on top of their already very dense tax payment. So I'm sure at some point Ballmer is going to do a double take at the total salary paid out to the Clippers. But as of now, it looks like he is willing to shell out some money. If we go back over the past about a year or so, we can see just how committed Steve Ballmer is to making this team a contender. Let's check out some of their prior extensions here over the last year or so. If we go back to October, so the start of last season, right before last season started, Terrence Mann, coming off of that absolutely awesome playoff performance in the 2021 playoffs, he got an extension for 2 years, $22 million. That was the first domino to fall. The second domino to fall was, I want to say it was about a month ago. Robert Covington, who they just traded for from the Portland Trail Blazers, he was signed to an extension worth 2 years, $24 million. So he's on the books, extended out for another 2 years, if we're considering his new term. Third, and this occurred yesterday, the next domino, Ivica Zubac, their starting center, re-signed for 3 years, $33 million. In order to make that happen, they declined their $7.5 million team option that they had on Zubac. So they were in control of his salary for next season. They decided to wipe that out and replace him with a new $11 million hold for his contract for next season. Now, that tells me a lot about Ballmer and this Clippers team. They're very committed to taking care of their guys. They could have punted a year, waited for Zubac to be a free agent, and then dealt with him at that time. They're getting ahead of the game by extending all their players. The only guy that's really hitting free agency here, as we see, is Nicholas Batum. He's the odd man out in all this. Everyone else is locked and loaded in for a contract over the next few years. So now that these guys are all taken care of, their top 10 players in rotation are all signed for next season. If you include John Wall, if you include Terrence Mann, who, by the way, is still under contract for $1.9 million. His extension doesn't kick in until 2023. So they're still getting a bargain deal with Terrence Mann at under $2 million. That's worth pointing out. But for all of their players for 22-23, most of those guys in the rotation are signed guaranteed salary for next year. The only guy that they're really going to have to deal with leaving potentially is going to be Isaiah Hartenstein. He was an awesome backup center for the Clippers last season. He's going to be in line for a raise, and it looks like the Clippers aren't going to be that team to give him that raise since they already exhausted their tax pyramid level with the signing of John Wall. They have no cap space to speak of. All they have left is pretty much their minimum salary, and they don't have the ability to give him the kind of contract he's probably looking for, which is going to be, I mean, it could be as much as 8 or 9 million, 7 million. I mean, they just don't have access to that kind of money. So he could be looking for a new home, which means that the Clippers in turn could be looking for a new player at that backup big position. But they did take care of Zubac at the starting center position. So their rotation is locked and loaded for next season. And just to clarify, the top two contracts on this team for this season, I was looking at last season previously, but Paul George and Kawhi are making a combined about $85 million between the two of them. I had previously said about $80 million. So a whole lot of money for two players on this team. But our calculated tax space for this team on our cap sheet on notradeclause.com is about $27 million over the tax line. So you do all the math, you multiply that out. The tax payment is about $40 million after John Wall. And then every signing after that just exponentially increases the amount of money they have to pay this team. So Steve Ballmer is worth a lot of money. Luckily, this isn't going to break the bank for him. He's a very rich person, and he is absolutely 100% committed to building a contender. That much is clear for this team. So there's nothing to worry about from Clippers land in terms of that. They will be in prime position to win a championship because they have the depth, they have the star power, they have the veteran leadership, they have a great coach. They just need the injury bug to just stay off of them for 1 year, and they're going to be right there in the hunt with the Warriors, with the Mavs, with all those other teams at making a legitimate run to the 2022-2023 championship. That's going to be a team to watch for sure. We'll just have to see how John Wall turns out on that team. There's a lot we can talk about as far as on-court fit, but suffice to say, it's going to be an adjustment period. Reggie Jackson has been a starter almost his entire career. John Wall, the same thing. One of those guys are going to have to relinquish the reins a little bit. Maybe they play together a little bit, but somebody's going to have a reduction in their minutes in order to make this thing work. Maybe it's John Wall. Maybe he's just gotten a little bit older and he realizes he's lost a step. Maybe it's Reggie Jackson seeing a chance to win a championship. He relinquishes the starting role. My guess, John Wall starts coming off the bench. At some point, maybe he takes over in the starting role. But the big question mark for him is going to be his shooting. As a catch and shoot threat, he's pretty solid, but he's not a guy you're going to be able to rely on at creating his own shot from three and making that consistently. So we're going to have to see how he acclimates to playing with a bunch of other stars around him. He's not used to that necessarily in the kind of roles he's had in the past. But if he can create for himself a little bit in the paint, if he can be a decent finisher, he's always been a good passer. Start the break a little bit, get the team some easy transition opportunities. He could be a big plus for them. He doesn't have to be the John Wall of 2016-17 when he was an all-star. He just needs to be a solid rotation player, a solid starter. Paul George and Kawhi can handle the rest. There's plenty of spacing around him, plenty of shooters. That's going to be an environment where I see John Wall having a great impact and potentially helping this team get over the hump to a championship. No doubt about it. So moving on to our second news story of this week, of the past few days, it's been a whirlwind, guys. Like, keep it locked on Twitter, keep it locked on No Trade Clause. Things are going fast and furious, I'm telling you. But the Knicks are creating a good amount of drama right now because Knicks are going to Knicks. They're chasing Jalen Brunson in free agency. They've made several moves in order to open up the cap space just to have the chance. I emphasize that because it's not a guarantee. Reportedly, Brunson is going to have off-season meetings with the Knicks, with the Mavericks, and also the Miami Heat. They snuck their name into the conversation. It seems like the Heat are always in the conversation for a big-time free agent. It's just how they do. It's how their front office works. They have that level of appeal in that team. But honestly, Jalen Brunson, he's in control of his own destiny. He had a fantastic playoff run. It's the equivalent. It's the equivalent of a college player having a fantastic NCAA tournament run, getting to the Elite Eight, the Final Four, balling out in the process, and setting themselves up to have a great chance at a new lucrative deal in free agency. It's been reported that Brunson is going to command a max deal from one of these teams of free agency, and that's saying a lot for a guy that was a second-round pick who is maybe, if we're being absolutely generous with his height, maybe 6 feet tall, had a sensational season for the Mavericks. The second guy in that pecking order behind Luka Doncic. I mean, couldn't have had a better season heading into free agency. He's going to make himself a whole lot of money, $100 to $110 million over the next 4 years. That's a big deal for Brunson. But what the Knicks did in order to put themselves in a position to acquire Brunson is trade Nerlens Noel, Kemba Walker, and Alec Burks to Detroit to open up that max cap space. So if we head on over to their cap sheet, they're now in possession of about $35 million in total salary. They still have Taj Gibson on the books for a non-guaranteed deal of $5 million. That's a whole lot of money for a guy that's 13 years into his career and is clearly a diminished player at this point. But when you got Thibodeau in the mix, he's got to keep around some of his vets from the old days. I think it keeps some of his energy up and helps him just kind of reminisce on the old times. I think that's got to be the explanation. So they have about 30, they could have about $35 million in total cap space. If they cut Taj off of that non-guaranteed deal, they could open up 35, but they don't have to do that. Brunson's salary, their starting salary on his new max contract would be about 30 or about a little bit less than 30. So they have the space, they have just enough space to acquire him. So we're looking at the possibility of this Knicks team having a core of Jalen Brunson, RJ Barrett, who is also in line for an extension. So they have to address that situation here soon as well. And then Julius Randle, who's entering a year where he's going to make 23, followed by 25, 27, and a player option for 29 million in about 3 years. So initially, I know a lot of people thought the same way I did about this deal. I was very skeptical of the trades they made, of the target they're pursuing in free agency, Jalen Brunson. no one's going to come out here and say that Jalen Brunson is an all-star or a superstar in this league. He's not a tier one guy. You can't build a franchise around him. With all due respect to Jalen Brunson, I mean, he's a fantastic player. He had a great season, and he has exceeded expectations relative to his draft stock by far. He's been sensational. But he's just not quite worth a max contract in my eyes. He's not a franchise player. He's not a tier one player. But what he is to us as the general public, as fans, and what he is to the New York Knicks are completely different things. We have to keep in mind that the New York Knicks have been in straight poverty for over a decade when it comes to their starting point guards. Let's go through their starting point guards since 2009. I got this off of Twitter here. This is very insightful. Chris Duhon in 2009, Raymond Felton in 2010, Tony Douglas in 11, back to Raymond Felton in 12, Prigioni, Shane Larkin, Jose Calderon, D. Rose, Ramon Sessions, Trey Burke, Alonzo Trier. You guys remember Zoe Trier? Yeah, he's how quickly do we forget about him? Alfred Payton in 2020. And in 2021, it didn't get much better. So looking across the past 12 to 13 years of point guards in New York, average at best. Average at best. I mean, their last great point guard was Stephon Marbury. Just consider that for a moment. Alfred Payton was their starting point guard 2 years ago. Trey Burke. I mean, I'm not trying to disrespect these guys, but these are barely rotation level players that are starting for the New York Knicks, one of the biggest markets in the country and in the NBA. So for the Knicks, with a market like that, they want to compete at all cost. Not necessarily be elite, not necessarily win a championship, but their number one priority in that market, at least from what I can tell, is to be competitive year in and year out. They have one of the biggest markets. They have a humongous TV deal. They have crazy fans. There's so much pressure in that city to be great every season. And most years, they're not. But man, do they go ahead and try to do it. They sign the big names. They offer out the big contracts. They give lucrative extensions. They're throwing darts at the wall. Nothing seems to really stick for that long, but they're giving it a shot. If I were the Knicks, I would take the slow and steady approach. I'm sure as many of you would. But with the Knicks, it just seems like their priorities are a little bit different than, let's say, the Pistons, who I'm going to get to in a moment. The Pistons are slow and steady. Most of these teams are slow and steady, and it pays off for them. But with the Knicks, I don't know if it's ownership. I don't know who is in their ear, but it's like, hey, we have to win 30 games. We have to win 35 games. We have to be at least a semi-playoff team. We have to be in play-in team. Whatever it takes to make that happen, do it. Even if it comes at the expense of being a title contender. That's the thing about this deal. This doesn't put them in the title contention hunt. It may not even put them in the playoff hunt. But what it could do is solidify their core. It gives them a good, nice, fairly young piece to place alongside Randall and RJ to help them develop, to give them easier looks. But it does lower their ceiling a little bit, at least on the surface. Now, they could make other moves down the line to, of course, reinforce their core. But as it stands today, it doesn't look like a title contender. So how far can this core go, honestly? I see maybe a play-in team at best. Maybe they squeak into the 8th spot in the East. They're getting dismantled. The East is so deep right now. Milwaukee, Miami, Boston, Philly, Toronto, Atlanta. Going to get to them in a moment. They just had a huge deal to propel themselves back into the elite class of the East. The East is stiff competition, and this deal gets them nowhere near the elite tier of the East, but it does get them in a position to be somewhat competitive. So quickly over to Detroit to highlight them for a second. They take on the contracts of Burks, Noel, Kemba Walker. You add those together, you stir it all up. You're looking at a combined total of $28 million that they're on the hook for in 2022, 2023. Now, as a result of this, they did gain a good amount of draft capital. So they got their 2023 second rounder back from the Knicks. They got a 2024 second that's coming from the Heat in the deal. And they also got $6 million in cash, which according to the CBA rules, that's about the maximum allowed to be distributed or received in a given year. So I believe that resets here in July 1st, but for this year, which ran for July 2021 to June 2022, that was about the max that the Knicks could have given the Pistons. So they maxed out their cash allocation in this deal. But honestly, it's not a whole lot they're getting back. They're just getting back a second rounder they originally had. They're getting a 2024 second from the Heat. That's sure to be average at best, and a little bit of money. So the Pistons are just being the good guy here. They're taking on the bad contracts. They're taking on the unwanted salary in order to reinforce their draft capital. Completely opposite approach from the Knicks. They're taking their time. They're using this year as another developmental year. They're bringing a lot of their guys slowly. They're making shrewd moves in and outside the draft. They're just making little crude or little slight moves in order to bolster the roster. So now their cap space is down to, I mean, a lot could change here. They do have the Marvin Bagley III cap hold, which is eating up their space, but they could open up $20 million or so of cap space still. It looks like they've spent their way out of the DeAndre Ayton sweepstakes, but they still do have some cap room that they can utilize to gain even more draft capital. So quickly looking at their draft capital situation, they do have a solid amount of picks. And I tweet about this pretty often over on my Twitter page if you guys want some insights on draft pick situation for various teams. But for the Pistons, they have several first, which are protected. They have several seconds that are coming from other teams. They don't have a whole lot of their own seconds. So in their various deals in draft night and in free agency here in the offseason, they are accumulating a lot of assets here. None of them are really going to make that big of an impact on their own. But you look at it all together, why not use that cap space that instead of going out there and signing a Brunson and just blowing it all at one player who probably doesn't even get you in the title contention hunt, you use that space in order to take on contracts that can then be used for future deals later to get a star or cash in those picks, get the players, turn them into stars. So two different approaches. It's very interesting to see how teams in different situations approach free agency, the draft, trades. It's all really fascinating. So keep an eye on these teams. They might not be done. Pistons want more picks. Knicks want more quality players. We'll see how it gets done. All I know is the Knicks faithful will be in shambles if they're not able to acquire Jalen Brunson after dishing out all these salaries. That would be a brutal blow. And I'm not sure who they would turn to after that in order to use that cap space. Hopefully that doesn't happen. That would be a nightmare scenario for New York for sure. One more news story to cover here this evening on this podcast is going to be a deal that broke probably not even 6 hours before I'm going live here on this podcast. DeJounte Murray getting shipped over to the Atlanta Hawks for draft compensation and Danilo Gallinari. Now, this deal has been in the pipeline for a few days. There was speculation that Murray was on the trading block. There was talks of him going to the Timberwolves or the Knicks, but he ends up going to the Hawks. Initially, it was said that he was going to be exchanged for John Collins, which didn't really make sense to me because I'm sure the Hawks don't want to give up John Collins that easily. And I'm also sure from the Spurs perspective, John Collins is pretty young, but I mean, he's about the same age as DeJounte, and he's, I want to say, maybe a slightly worse player than DeJounte. And he has a lot of salary owed over the next 4 or 5 years. So it didn't really make sense, from at least from my point of view, for the Spurs to acquire him. Now, to acquire Gallinari makes a lot more sense because he's an expiring deal. So that opens up their books in the coming years to do whatever they want with that extra salary. Now, their total pick haul is pretty legit. It's not Anthony Davis, Paul George levels of pick compensation, but it's very solid nonetheless. So according to Woj, this trade will involve a pick via Charlotte going to the Spurs from the Hawks, as well as 2 unprotected first-round picks, 2025, 2027, going to the Spurs from the Hawks. Also, there will be a pick swap in 2026. So if the Hawks happen to have a worse record than the Spurs, you never know. 4 years, a lot can change in 4 years, guys. We know that. If the Hawks end up having a worse record, the Spurs can do a swap and they can grab that pick from the Hawks. So that could be pretty impactful down the line. Also, because DeJounte, his deal only lasts until about 2024. So maybe the Hawks aren't as good down the line. Maybe the Spurs are on the rise. Who knows? A lot can change given enough time. But that's a solid haul for the Spurs to get back for DeJounte. This is what was reported: 3 first-round picks, a swap, and an expiring contract. It's a high price to pay, but we have to keep in mind, DeJounte Murray is still a young player. He's in his mid-20s. He's coming off an all-star season. He's made a huge leap last season. He almost averaged a triple-double, about 8 rebounds and 9 assists, if I remember correctly. That's nothing to take lightly. I mean, DeJounte is one of the great defenders in our game. He's an all-defensive first-team talent on that end. He's a blossoming offensive player. He's learning the game. He's 6'5" with long arms. Defensively, the perfect complement to Trae Young. You hide Trae Young on a suboptimal offensive player on the other team if you can find it. You stick DeJounte on the best perimeter player. You can stick DeJounte on the Jason Tatums of the world, the Jaylen Browns of the world, the Steph Currys of the world, the Lukas. So you don't have to put that burden on somebody like a Bogdanovich or Kevin Huerter or even a DeAndre Hunter at certain points. DeJounte is the best defender to come through the Hawks in quite a long time, if we're being honest. They maintain Capella. They maintain Hunter. Their team is still probably not going to be an absolute just elite unit on defense, but what they will be is probably back to about decent average, maybe a little bit better on defense. That's what you want to see. The offense will take care of itself. It's just they wanted to get the defense to a point where it's not a liability anymore. They wanted to give Trae an outlet, a release valve when he's being doubled or triple teamed in the case of the Miami Heat as an opponent. But the Hawks got exactly what they wanted from a defensive perspective. The question for the Hawks will be, how do these guys coexist in the same backcourt on offense? Neither of these guys are great off the ball presence players. Trae is not a huge mover off the ball. He can shoot off the ball, but he's not really going to cut or open up extra space for the defense by relocating on the perimeter. DeJounte Murray, he can cut, but he's kind of the opposite of Trae. He's not going to be a great spot-up option as far as shooting the ball. He only shot about 31% from 3 last season, almost 32%. So he's not that great of a floor spacer. He's going to have to get creative as far as what he's going to do when he doesn't have the ball in his hands, which could be a decent amount. This is Trae Young we're talking about. Trae Young has one of the highest usage rates in the entire league, along with Luka Doncic. That's an adjustment period. A guy like Trae Young, he's not used to having an all-star in the backcourt with him. DeJounte commands touches. DeJounte is a very, very good offensive player. He's going to need to be involved in the offense a little bit more than Trae is used to having his running mate in the backcourt be. So as far as an on-court fit, I would give it about a B in terms of fit, because defensively, A1. Absolute perfection in terms of having a good, long, versatile defender next to Trae Young. On the other hand, these guys working off of each other, I think it's going to be clunky at first. They could figure it out. If one of these guys are willing to kind of put the ego aside, put their touches aside for the betterment of the team, it can definitely work. They can find ways around it. They're both very smart basketball players. It's just going to take some time, and neither of them are incredible threats off the ball. The thing about Kevin Huerter and Bogdanovich, they're great off-the-ball players. They're used to coming off of pin downs. They were used to relocating on the wings and the corners. They've been doing that their whole careers. That's nothing new for them. They're not primary options on offense. DeJounte is a primary option. He was the guy in San Antonio last year. So for Trae and DeJounte, there's going to be an adjustment period. And how far the Hawks go really depends on how much those guys are willing to sacrifice and how fast they find their footing with the other players. So from both points of view, for both teams, this trade looks to be a success. The Spurs get the picks they wanted. They get the draft capital to bolster what they already have. The Hawks get that missing piece. And to top it off, the Hawks did not have to part with John Collins, one of their better players on their team. And they also didn't have to part with all their first-round picks. If we go to their draft capital page, and they're still in possession of their own first in several years. The first-round pick they gave out in 2023 is a Charlotte first. They still have their first in 23. They still have it in 24. They still have it in 28 and in 29. So they still have about half of their first-round picks remaining. They still have several second-rounders. They have their second in 2024. It's top 55 protected. Same thing in 25. They have it in 26, 28, and 29. So the Hawks are by no means out of picks. They still have a lot that they can go to here. In the next 2 years, they still have it. It's not until about 24 where they start to lose control of their own pick. So the Hawks didn't empty the tank for DeJounte. He's not worth emptying the tank for. He's not a LeBron James or a Luka or a Giannis, but he is a guy worth making a splash for. When you have a talent like a talent like Trae Young, who led the team to the conference finals just a little over a year ago, you have to capitalize. That's why the Mavs went after Christian Wood. When you have franchise talents of that caliber, you can't allow the status quo to go on for too long. You have to capitalize on their talents, and that's how you get to a place of being an elite team and having a real shot at a championship. I admire what both of these teams have done in free agency. Luka and Trae always seem to be compared to each other. These trades are going to link their destinies once again. It's going to be fascinating to see who goes farther in the playoffs for next year. But for now, both teams get exactly what they want. And I'm curious to see if the Hawks have any more moves up their sleeves, because they still have some assets. John Collins is still in a lot of rumors. Something tells me they're not quite done wheeling and dealing just yet. So that's about all I got, guys. 40 minutes in. Won't take up too much more of your time. Thanks for tuning in. I'll be sure to have somebody join me here on the pod here next week and get somebody back in for you guys. But before I go, just wanted to shout out Sports Business Classroom one more time. We're about 8 days. By the time you're watching this, probably about 7 days out from the Business of Basketball experience over in Summer League, Sports Business Classroom. There might be a little bit more time to get registered. Check out their website, sportsbusinessclassroom.com, for all the information. There's going to be great speakers. It's going to be a great time, some great basketball. I'll be out there with the NTC team, plenty of other people in the basketball world. Even if you can't go to SBC, there's plenty of other programs throughout the year that SBC puts on that are virtual. So be sure to get involved in those and check out exactly what they have to offer, because if you're looking to break into basketball, can't think of a better option than SBC to get your foot in the door and jumpstart your career, your basketball journey. So thanks again, everybody, for joining me on this 37th installment of the NTC podcast. We're going to be hard at work over on our site. Check out notradeclause.com for all the latest information as it pertains to draft capital, our cap sheets, the transaction log, and also just anything you're looking for in terms of keeping up to date with the transactions that are to come in this offseason. So till next time, guys, I'm signing out. You enjoy the rest of your evening here, and we'll be back next week with a whole another installment of the NTC podcast. Take care, everybody.
Some people want it to happen, some wish it would happen, others make it happen. I'm Bo Estes, the Department Chair for Media at Sports Business Classroom, and I'm offering you a chance to put into action the words of Michael Jordan and make it happen at the NBA level this summer in Las Vegas. At SBC, each of our students receives extensive, hands-on training from successful professionals currently working in the business, and then our students put that knowledge into play. Each student will handle play-by-play duties as well as analysis, calling multiple NBA games at Summer League. Additionally, our students will work as studio hosts and analysts from our state-of-the-art SBC set located in the atrium of the Thomas and Mack Center. The training and opportunities don't end there, though. Our professionals will teach you the art of storytelling and the skill required to successfully run your social media accounts. This training culminates in a session designed to teach you how to start and grow your media business. Our SBC students will leave Las Vegas with an improved skill set and a refined understanding of the different roles and requirements to work in media. That newfound knowledge is designed to launch a career or supplement a parallel career in the business of basketball. Don't wish it would happen. Make it happen for your career today by visiting sportsbusinessclassroom.com.